His steps were slow, careful, precarious. But John Lewis knew the way, and his gaze was steady, even peaceful, as he took in the old steel ramparts above his head and the brown asphalt under his feet. It was a Sunday in March 2020 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, not unlike that first fabled Sunday 55 years before. Then, as now, the breeze was cool, the late winter sun soft, and the water below silent and swirling. The civil rights hero and longtime U.S. Congressman from Atlanta was back again, walking the old path, his mind a mix of past and present. Once stocky from endless church suppers and innumerable political picnics and banquets, he was now frail and thin, shockingly so to friends accustomed to his familiar girth, a thickness of body that had made him so reassuringly solid, so central, so orienting, so very much John Lewis. The weight of loss was not a matter of choice, but of affliction, the worst kind of affliction, the result of cancer that had attacked his pancreas. Yet here he was, just weeks after his 80th birthday, smaller but undeterred, standing once more above the Alabama River. He led his fellow pilgrims up the bridge. They sang, inevitably, a few verses of "We Shall Overcome." Lewis knew the song was important, just as days like these were important. They brought the story to life. As the years passed, he worried that the civil rights movement was receding into myth and legend. The battles of more than a half-century ago could seem as distant as Antietam. The last chapter of Lewis's life, then, was about history and hope, remembrance and renewal. His message was consistent. If the young people of the South, young black people, young women, young men, could change the world then, he'd say, we can do it again now. There were these pilgrimages to Selma, to Montgomery, to Birmingham, the commemorations, and day in and day out the fact of being John Lewis, a man whose physical scars mirrored the wars of a nation. Quietly charismatic, forever courtly, implacably serene, he was charming about his effect on others. People come up to me in airports. They walk into the office. They say, I'm going to cry. I'm going to pass out. And I say, please, don't pass out. I'm not a doctor. He was, rather, a preacher and a prophet, a man of faith and of action. Surrounded by civil rights veterans and members of Congress on that day in 2020, Lewis was handed a microphone. His frame may have been diminished, but his voice was not. That voice was still big and booming and passionate, a surprise often to audiences who saw Lewis as a quiet man. He was quiet, though, only until he had something to say, and when he had something to say, he said it with the preacherly cadences he'd honed delivering sermons to a flock of chickens on his family's tenant farm in Pike County, Alabama, a place Lewis recalled so small it was nearly impossible to find on a map. It is good to be in Selma, Alabama, one more time. His words to the crowd, pausing between phrases, letting the words sink in. On this bridge, just a few short years ago, a few of the children of God started on a journey. He'd been one of them, just 25 years old, and already, from the age of 20, a bloodied soldier of the movement. They'd been there, he recalled, because of his teacher in nonviolence, the Reverend James M. Lawson, who stood there still in 2020 at the age of 91. They'd been there because of Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph D. Abernathy, and Lewis's fellow student activist Diane Nash. And they'd been there, Lewis told the other pilgrims, because of the saints of old. To John Lewis, the truth of his life, a truth he had lived out on that bridge in 1965, was of a piece with the demands of the gospel to which he had dedicated his life since he was a child. He was moved by love, not by hate. He was as important to the founding of the modern and multi-ethnic 20th and 21st century America as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Samuel Adams were to the creation of the Republic in the 18th century. This is not hyperbole. It is a fact, observable, discernible, undeniable fact. On this anniversary, Ralph and Juanita Abernathy's daughter, Wanda Lynn, took the microphone from Lewis and broke into a hymn of the movement. Listening intently, his eyes and ears taking everything in, Lewis simply said, God bless you. He'd heard the song before. He'd seen the sights before. He'd walked this pavement before. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, in a planned march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the systematic exclusion of African Americans from the voting booth in violation of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, still flagrantly ignored in the American South a century on, Lewis and his friend Hosea Williams were stopped by Alabama authorities at the foot of the bridge, some on horseback, all wielding weapons. The white officers charged the column of nonviolent marchers. Lewis was beaten, and lying on the pavement was ready to die. Yet he survived, and the images of the attack that Sunday helped push President Lyndon B. Johnson to call for and pass federal legislation guaranteeing voting rights.